Hello coders and welcome to another Renaissance Coders tutorial. My name is Darren and this week we are continuing our C# series. This is the fourth episode in the series and we're going to talk about methods. Now in the last couple of episodes we talked about if statements and switch statements. So if you're a little bit foggy on those topics or you don't know what I'm talking about, go ahead and check those videos out. They're going to be a big help to us here in this tutorial. So what is a method? Well, a method in short is a way of copying and pasting code that we want to use regularly in our programs. Let's say we want to add numbers frequently in our program. It's going to help us a lot if we just have something, let's say a line of code that we create and we pass it to numbers, and that method or function is going to return the answer of those two numbers added together. So how does this work? Before I can define that, we need to talk about some terminology. First thing is scope. Our methods, just like our variables, are going to have scope. We can say private or public. Now, private scope is going to determine whether or not the method can be seen from another class, which I know we haven't talked about that yet. Public scope is, again, it's going to say, okay, other classes can see this method. So we're not going to talk too much about that right now. We can talk about that in a different tutorial. Okay, so first thing is scope. Second thing, we want to talk about the return type. The return type is going to say what kind of data type do we want to return from this method. So do we want to return an integer value? Do we want to return a Boolean value? Do we want to return a double value? I think you guys get the idea. Next thing that we're going to define is the method name. So the method name is whatever we want to call it. In our previous example, we might say this method name is going to be add. So we want to add two values, so we're going to call the method add. The next thing you guys need to know is parameters. Okay, parameters are going to be, in our example, two numbers that we want to pass to our method that are going to be added together. Okay, so whenever we call the function or method, as you'll see later in this video, we're going to pass it two numbers, and those numbers are going to be added and then returned to us. That brings us to our next term and our last term, which is the return keyword in C#. Now return is going to be our way of exiting the method. If our return type is void, then we can just say return and it's not going to return any value. However, if our return type is integer or it's a float or a double, then our return keyword will return a variable of that type. Okay, so let's go ahead and make practical use of all these terms and get our first method up and running. Okay, now we're going to do several iterations of the method add. So we're going to start off with the most basic style of function and then work our way up to the most complicated type of function. That way that you guys can soak in the terminology and the concepts really well. Okay, so let's start off by creating our method add. What we're going to do is start with our scope, as I said previously, which is going to be private because, again, this method only needs to communicate with this file, this class called program. Okay. Next, we're going to say static. And I'm not going to go into detail of what static means. Just know for now that you need to use static here because static void main is a static method, okay? So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. Next up is our return type. Like I said, this can be void, this can be int, this can be double. For now, we're just going to say void to keep things simple. Then we have our method name add, followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses is where our parameters would go, which would be like the two numbers we want to add. For now, again, we're keeping it really simple, so we're not going to put anything in there. Now what we're going to do is create some integer value. We'll just say something like int num equals 2 plus 2. And what we want to do with this is write it out to the console so that we can verify that num is going to be equal to 4. So what we'll do is we'll say console.writeLine, and then we'll say something like our number is colon, and then we're going to use the concatenation operator, which is the plus sign. And again, the concatenation operator simply puts the variable into our string. So we're going to say plus, and then the variable name, which is num. Now all we need to do is come up to our static void method main. And what we'll do is call add, and followed by the parentheses. Any method is going to have parentheses whenever you call it, okay? And that should be it, guys. So let's go ahead and run the program to see what we get. Okay, so that works out pretty well. Let's go ahead and complicate this method a little bit by adding a return type. So if we're going to add a return type, we want to change void to int, since we're dealing with integers right now. Now we have int num equals 2 plus 2. This is the value that we want to return. So let's say C#'s keyword return, and then pass num, or we'll just say return num. And what this is going to do is when we call this method, it's going to return a value, and our goal is to put that in some integer inside main. So for now, let's say int, inside static void main, we'll say int answer equals add. And as you can see, we get no errors from that because it knows that add is actually essentially 4. Think about add being 4 right now because it's returning that value. Now what we can do is say console.writeLine, our number is, and this time it's going to be answer. Okay, let's run this to make sure we still get 4. Okay, great, so that still works. Now I know things are starting to get a little bit complicated, so you guys might want to start studying what we're doing. I know if you've never used methods before, this can seem really foreign. So let's just recap what we've learned so far. We have a scope variable private. I'm sorry, not a variable, scope keyword private. Then we have static, which again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. Just know that since main is a static void, we need to make our method static. And then we have our return type int, which return is just going to return an integer value. You've already learned about variables if you've seen my previous videos. And then we're going to have our method name followed by parentheses, which we'll go into more detail on that in a little bit. And then inside the method, inside our curly braces, is going to be our method logic. So we're just adding 2 numbers and then putting that into an integer called num, and then we're just going to return num. Now come back up to main, we have to create an integer called answer and set it equal to that method. Then we can just say console.writeLine and output our answer, and we'll always get 4. Okay, so you guys know all about scope. Well, not all about scope, but you guys know about scope a little bit at least, and you know about return types. So let's start going into some of the more complicated stuff. So we're progressively getting deeper and deeper into the method jungle. The next thing we're going to talk about, and probably the last thing for this video, is going to be parameters. Okay, so I said that we'd be able to copy and paste our code, and right now it just doesn't seem like that would be a logical move because all our method does is add 2 plus 2. We're just going to get 4 every time, right? Well, parameters are going to allow us to get or receive a different output from our method. So let's start by just putting in one parameter. We'll say int a. So a is going to be, well, let me make this a little bit of a better name. We'll say int num1. Okay, so this is going to be our number 1 int. What we're going to do is come up to static void main. We're going to put an integer value in there. So 5 is an int. And the reason this makes sense is because your method is expecting, based on your parameter, an integer value. And so we passed 5, it sees that that's an integer value, and everybody's happy. Now the question is, what can we do with num1? Well, first I want to just go ahead and emphasize that num1 is private to this method. So you can't use num1, you can't use this variable anywhere else inside this program other than inside this method. So that would be a good example of encapsulation. Encapsulation is based on scope. So num1 you can think of as private. So you guys now have a better understanding of scope. So how are we going to use num1? Let's just for now say int num equals num1 plus 2. Okay, and we're going to return num, so we're still going to get an int. Now let's see what we get as our output. Okay, so we got 7, and we should expect that because we put 5 into num1 and then we added 2 to num1. So 5 plus 2 equals 7, so it all makes sense and everybody's happy. Let's go ahead and add one more parameter to this. Let's say int num2. So we have 2 integer values that we want to pass. If you come up here, you might see a red line under your method. So let's go and add a comma signifying that 5 is the end of that parameter, that first parameter, and then we're going to say, well, let's say 2. Okay, so we want to see if we can get the same output. So we're going to have, basically what this method is doing is it's saying add 5 and 2. Okay, so we have 2 parameters now, but we're not using the second parameter inside our method. So what we need to do is say int num equals num1 plus num2. So let's get rid of that 2 and replace it with num2. Now if we run our program, we should get 7 again. Okay, so we still get 7, so everything still worked. Okay, so let's do a quick recap here before we move on. Okay, so we talked about how we can add parameters and then use those parameters within our method. Please note, and this is a common mistake, so I really want to emphasize it, please note that these parameters num1 and num2 can only be used within this method. Outside of this method, they just don't exist, okay? They have private scope, they're encapsulated inside this method. Just please remember that, all right? This is a really common mistake. People will try to use num1, for instance, inside main or inside other functions, and they'll be confused as to why the program doesn't recognize it, okay? So we talked about that. We talked about how we can add those and use those variables within our method and then still output them into a variable within main and then get the same answer as if we were to not use parameters and hardcode values into our methods, okay? So a cool thing about methods is we can use as many parameters as we want. We can insert as many of these guys as we want, and they don't have to be the same data type. Let's say we want this to add double values, okay? So this is going to be decimal values now that we're adding. Let's change our return type from int to double. Let's change our parameter types to double. So we're going to have to change both of them. All right, and then instead of int num, this needs to be double num because you can't add two doubles and put them into an integer value. Okay, so double num equals num1 plus num2. We're going to have to come back up to main and say that int answer is now a double answer. Okay, so we can say double answer equals add 5 and 2. Let's change these. Well, the reason 5 can be a double is because the program recognizes basically any value, whether it's a whole number or it's not a whole number, it's a fraction or whatever. Those can all be doubles. So we don't want to use 5 and 2 because that's kind of boring. We just use those. Let's go ahead and use some decimal values. So let's say something like 5.7325, and then we'll say like 2.342. Okay, so we can use these double values now, and we should be able to run the program and see some decimal output. Let's see what we get. Okay, so that works as expected. Now earlier I said that we could use multiple parameters, and that's a really cool thing about methods. We can use as many parameters as we want. So let's go ahead and add, we'll add 2 more parameters here. So we'll say double num3, double num4. Okay, and you can see up here in static void main, whenever we're calling our method and we're only passing it 2 parameters, that now the method has 4 parameters, it's throwing us an error saying that, hey, you need to add more parameters here because we don't recognize a method called add with only 2 parameters. We only know of a method called add with 4 parameters. Okay, so if you're adding parameters, keep that in mind. You need to pass any parameter that your function defines to the function call. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now in this method I want to start using some different math operators. We're going to go ahead and rename it to add, subtract, divide. That's going to be our new method name, and that's because what I want to do is add 2 numbers, and then I want to divide that by, or subtract that by our 3rd number, and then divide that by our 4th number. Okay, so let's say down here under our double num equals num1 plus num2 line, we're going to say num equals num3 divided by num. Okay, we can use num and set it equal to num because num is actually a value. The way that these operations work is anything on the right side of the equal operator, or this is actually called the assignment operator. So anything on the right side of the assignment operator is going to happen first before it gets put into, in this case, num. Okay, so the first thing that's going to happen is num3 divided by num, and then that value is going to be put into num. So that's why we call this the assignment operator, not the equal operator. Okay, so one more thing to do. We have one more parameter that is unused. We're going to say num equals num4 minus num. Okay, I think I mixed that up. I think I said I was going to subtract first, but it doesn't really matter. We used all of our parameters, and so that is going to satisfy that method. Now we need to come up to static void main and rename it, because now it's called add, subtract, divide. And again, we need to add 2 more parameters to this, because in our definition of our method we have 4 parameters and we're only passing 2 currently. So let's add some random decimal values. Add whatever you want. I'm just going to add 5.33 and then 8.22. Okay. Now we should be able to run this and see what kind of value we get. If you're putting in different values, then you're going to get a different number from me. But I think you guys see how this works. Okay, so we haven't really utilized methods that well, and I hope you guys aren't thinking this is just a big waste of time. So let me go ahead and show you what I was talking about with the whole copy and pasting thing. Okay, so if you think about like a calculator or something like that, the calculator is going to run these adding and subtracting and dividing operations, all the time using different numbers. So let's go ahead and just do that, So previously, if you didn't know about methods, then you would have to call this every single time. You'd have to call this block of code. You'd have to write this out every single time somebody wanted to do an operation on some different numbers. But now, since we defined that using general variables, we can go ahead and use this method on whatever values that we want. So let's just copy and paste this line of code, double answer equals add, subtract, divide. And what we need to do is set this equal to a different variable name. So we'll say answer2, and then let's pass in some different values here. It doesn't really matter what values you pass in, as long as you pass in different values so that you can see and understand that it works and why it's important. And then we'll just do it one more time, say double answer 3, and then pass some new values to it. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to hopefully understand that we're essentially writing, how many lines of code is this? This is 1, 2, 4, 6, 7. Okay, so this is 7 lines of code, and we're using it 3 times. So basically we just cut down 14 lines of code in like 2 minutes. Okay, so it didn't take us long at all to write that, and we saved a lot of lines of code, so it looks a lot more readable now and hopefully easier to understand. So let's go ahead and, well, first we need some more console.writeLine. So we'll say console.writeLine. Our number 2 is, okay, we'll pass concatenation. We'll say answer 2. And I'm just going to copy and paste this line of code here. And we'll say console.writeLine. Our number 3 is, and then we want to pass answer 3 using the concatenation operator on that third console.writeLine. Now whenever we run this program, we should see 3 different forms of output. They're all going to be different numbers because we pass different values to the parameters. Now I want to talk about how the computer actually reads all of this logic with methods, because it can be difficult at first to understand how the program skips around throughout your code. So it starts off in static void main at the first line, which is going to be bool running equals true. I know that this in no way really relates to this tutorial, but that's what it's going to see first. Then it's going to come down and it's going to see double answer equals add, subtract, divide. And it's going to enter that method. Remember that on the right side of the assignment operator, this code is going to happen first. So it's going to jump into add, subtract, divide method. So the code logic is going to go again from bool running equals true, then it's going to skip down to this method here, and it's going to say double num equals num1 plus num2, num equals num3 divided by num equals num4 divided by num, return num. Okay, so the code is going to do that. Whenever it sees return, it's going to exit out of the method, come back up to static void main, and then skip down to the next line, double answer 2 equals add, subtract, divide. Again, it's going to go into the method from there, come down until it sees return, then it's going to come back and put that value into answer 2. Then it's going to skip down to the next line, double answer 3 equals, okay, so on and so forth. I think you guys understand how it works. So what it's going to do is, in short, look into that method, skip down to whatever line of code that method is at, run the logic until it sees return. If it's a void type, it's going to run until it hits the last line of code inside that method. And then what it's going to do is go back up to main where it left off and continue running in the continuous loop. All right, guys, you guys have made it to the end of the methods tutorial. I know it was a long journey, but now you know all about methods. You know all about scope. You know about return types. You know about naming your methods, passing parameters, using the correct data type. And in general, that's what a method is. So I think that you guys can continue using methods, and I want to challenge you by trying to create a small little calculator simulator where you're passing in values to add or subtract and divide and multiply. And if you're fancy, then you can do some exponential calculations as well. But I want to challenge you to do those little side projects on your own so that you can really understand methods and how they work. That is going to conclude the C# tutorial, guys. I hope you learned a lot about methods, and if you did, go ahead and subscribe so you can get the latest on all of our upcoming tutorials. I'll be handling the C# and most of the Unity stuff. Jared's going to be helping me out with the Unity stuff as well, but he also has his own tutorials in web development and JavaScript. So if you're into that stuff, go ahead and check him out. He does a great job with those. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next tutorial.